verses 10 through 15 and 20 through 27, although I believe I snuck in 16 through 19 on the slide here. So we're talking about seeking godly wisdom in furtherance of the unit's theme of thinking biblically. And it probably has still, I think, today a lot of application, particularly these days. The preface in the lesson book talks about what happened in the early 19th century in our nation, because it started out by having what was called the Second Great Awakening in the 1800s, and because they had a lot of societal reforms that kind of harken back to a lot of biblical teachings. They had a lot of people commit themselves to Christianity, a lot of revivals, a lot of baptisms and things like that. But then by the second half of the 1800s, our nation's churches and the Christian schools in our country were in a lot of turmoil. And I think that was kind of buckling up for the 20th century in the 1900s. And we're into the 21st century now, and I think somebody said, hold my beer, because it's gotten really bad. By the second half of the 19th century, the 1800s, that first half of the century of believers had really largely been replaced in our country by a bunch of skeptics and unbelievers. And one theory of what caused that transition between the first and the second half of the 1800s is that believers began to take the foundations and the essentials of their faith for granted. There was no longer religious, rigorous Christian teaching, and emotions became more important. And there were no longer teachings of the valid reasons why we should believe the biblical teaching. So we need to remember God gives us a lot of wisdom. Now the Bible is a lot more than an instruction book or a how-to manual, of course. But that's part of its purpose. That's part of what it's there for. And it's available to us. And I think Scott noted last week, particularly if you're online like Scott and I are, I have a Bible Gateway app. And Scott has, I think, a different app. And in each of those...
I have that one too.
you probably have a few of those apps. I just have the one. But I was astonished when I started subscribing to it about how many different versions of the Bible there are.
Oh, yeah.
And they each, I think I found out as Scott kind of coached me to look for, different versions will bring out different things, and you can focus on certain aspects of what we want to learn, sometimes from different versions, which is pretty neat. You just have to make sure that the version that you're looking at doesn't stray really wildly. So you do have to be careful.
Yeah. It's like, NIV is probably the one that may stray the most.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're reading a story, or if you're wanting to feel the emotion, there's one passage where, when Jesus was attacking the Pharisees, and then all of a sudden he breaks and says, "O Israel, how I long to hold you in my arms, but you are lost forever." I mean, it's just that emotion that NIV brings out that you never realized, that Jesus, he was attacking the Pharisees, calling them snakes, and then the next moment you could feel his own tears. But yet, yeah, there's certain verses that disappeared out of the NIV. So
And sometimes,
you have to read multiple ones.
yeah, and sometimes, as I've noted, the King James Version lapses back into high school Shakespeare, and my eyes are rolling back in my head going, that sounds real nice, but I'm not real sure what that means.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at another couple versions, usually my first go-to is the Amplify, because it translates it in a way that's more meaningful to me, where I can start going back and looking like, oh, okay, I can see that, and it kind of puts things in place where I can make more sense of things. But, I think we have strayed, by and large, a lot further than the 19th century. I don't think the 19th century folks would recognize where we're at today in large part. And that's a problem.
I was talking to someone last week. Imagine being, late 1800s, early 1900s pastor and talking about Israel. Israel hasn't existed in 1700 years.
Yeah.
And there was no even thought that it would ever become a reality.
It wasn't even a glimmer in anybody's eye, really, at that point.
Yeah.
It was a glimmer of God's eye, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's why I corrected myself. It wasn't a glimmer in the earthly eye,
Yeah.
in earthly geopolitics.
But yeah, imagine trying to these promises and stuff, and try to think of how humanly possible could that be?
Well, and also, I remember in my honors senior seminar course in undergrad, there was a big thick book on world history, and the gist of it was we had devolved into moral relativism. That's a problem, because there is such a thing as right and wrong, there is such a thing as truth and fact, there's such a thing as good and evil. And just because you feel one way or you want the result to be one way doesn't mean that's the correct answer. Yeah, there are a lot of hard questions, and there are a lot of hard answers that are the right thing to do, but you don't relish it, you don't like it, you feel bad for folks still when things don't come out the way maybe that they'd hoped, but perhaps maybe the way they should. I see that a lot in these child abuse and neglect cases. For the most part, I guarantee you the judges hurt when they have to terminate a parent's rights. That makes it a bad day for them, even though they're sitting there, they're struggling, trying to figure out what the right thing to do is, because they'll talk about it, sometimes on the bench, sometimes after the hearing. And they're like, I really didn't want to do that, but that's what needed to be done. And I hate that I'm the one that had to do that, or make that decision. But, in this day and age, it's like, well, we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. We don't want to call anybody out on anything. We don't want to say that anything is wrong. And we need to back off from that. I'm not saying go completely the other way, because we don't want to go back to legalism, because that's not the answer either. It's a very delicate, fine balance. But the point, I think, of today's lesson is going to be, you need to seek the wisdom that God has given us in the Bible. We need to remember the wisdom that's passed down to us from our elders, who fiddled around and found out the hard way, and hopefully we benefit from their experience as to the right way to do things, the wrong way to do things, and even moral principles to guide us in figuring out the new problems that they have never had to confront. And I think that more than anything is important today, because we've got a whole lot of new things that haven't had to be figured out before. Some have, and we still manage to screw that up a lot of times. But, there's a lot of new stuff too. So it's important to have not only the old way of doing things, the old answers that people have figured out because somebody else learned the hard way for us. And if we're smart enough to benefit from that experience and take that wisdom to apply it to things that already exist, we still need to know and understand how to work through the other problems. Because there are all kinds of tweaks and circumstances that we need to be able to think through. So we're in, like I said, Proverbs chapter 4, and this is one of the early chapters of Proverbs, and this is Solomon as a father talking to his son. And Solomon is trying to impart the godly wisdom that he has learned to let his son navigate life, as any good father would do, particularly on this Father's Day. So Solomon's telling his son, listen, but also kind of internalize what I'm telling you so you can apply these things to navigate all the crud that life's going to throw at you. Hear, O my son, and receive my sayings, and the years of thy life shall be many. I have taught thee in the way of wisdom, I have led thee in right paths. So that starts out pretty good. Again, your parents or older people in the community, they've been through some things. They're like Farmers Insurance. They've seen some things. They've learned some things. So they're going to hopefully try to teach us some lessons for some things that we haven't had to figure out on our own yet. And hopefully those parents and those community elders are going to give us not only specifics, but also they're going to give us principles that are enduring. Because again, we're going to get hit with situations in our life that are not exactly the same, and maybe there's an important difference that's going to mean, well, this principle meant one outcome in this situation, but there's some interesting little important facts in another situation that we're confronting that means the right outcome is something at least a little different or maybe entirely different, and we're going to have to figure that out. When it says, the years of thy life shall be many, is that a guarantee that, if you follow the wisdom, you're going to have a long life? I wish. I don't think so. But if we follow that wisdom on average, we're going to have healthy habits and faith in God, and then again, on average, that usually is going to bode well overall. Doesn't mean we're not going to have some stumbles, but overall, for most, it's going to work out better, a lot better that way. When Solomon's talking about, I've taught thee in the way of wisdom, and I have led thee in right paths. So what Solomon's telling his son is, I'm giving you principles and some theories, but it's not, what I'm telling you is not always strictly theoretical. There are paths. Sometimes there's kind of a map. And when he's talking about right paths, literally that means a straight path, a linear path. I don't think it means exactly strictly linear with absolutely no curves or gentle curves or deviations, but the paths of wisdom are straightforward, they're open, they're morally upright. Not going to look like Route 73 or some parts of 310. You know, you're not going to be going like this. If you're going like that, you need to ask yourself some serious questions, because you're probably not on the right path. You're taking too many twists and turns. You know, if you're taking that many twists and turns and you're trying to figure out your logic as to why that's the right path, why that's the moral path, why that's the righteous path with God, you probably need to dig out your hip waders. I feel the same way sometimes, actually oftentimes, with our state Supreme Court reading court decisions. Because particularly especially in family law, it seems like, and I've held this opinion for probably about 2 decades, it oftentimes, in certain areas of the law particularly, of course I pay attention to the family law decisions and the child abuse and neglect decisions rather than maybe contract law or some other more dry areas of law, because family law and child abuse and neglect, they're very human-centered, and
You're very emotional.
yes, humans are messy. We are messy critters. Emotionally, logically, we're a hot mess. And these cases are the epitome most of the time of hot messes, but even in family court when they're talking about financial decisions, about dividing a marital estate, what's marital, what's not, what counts, what doesn't, as marital versus separate, a lot of times it seems to me, again, and I've held this opinion for probably at least 2 decades, that a lot of times it seems like our court picks out the result they want, and then they go through legal gymnastics to try to justify on precedent and on legal principles how they got to that result. And sometimes, and too often in my opinion, it's a really painful process to watch. You know, other times they lay out a very logical decision. It's like, oh, that's good. I want to print this out and I want to keep this one because I think this is well reasoned. It gives guidance. You know, it relies very clearly on certain principles and it doesn't contradict itself. And I think this is worth keeping to follow in the future. And then there are other ones, it's like, okay, y'all just decided what you wanted to do and you figured you'd throw some words in between to, you know, kind of disguise what you were doing. And those are the ones that are taking the twists, the turns, the back loops. And I forget what it was, but here, within the last 3 months, there were 2 decisions came out. I forget whether it came out same day or the next day. And we're looking at them and going, okay, well, this one says this is the outcome because of this. And the other decisions gave a different outcome and had a completely different reasoning, and we couldn't figure out why. And that's what we're talking about here. There's a lot of parallels with that, at least as to me. So anytime we're having to do those gymnastics in our logic and our reasoning and our facts to justify what we want the answer to be, that ought to be blaring off a 5-alarm fire alarm in your head that you're messing up, you're doing something wrong. And you need to go back and start from square one. Where thou goest, thy steps shall not be straitened, and when thou runnest, thou shalt not stumble. Take fast hold of instruction, let her not go, keep her, for she is thy life. So here Solomon expands to his son on his use of pathways. Straighten is an old word, and I don't know if it's exactly the same, but I kept thinking of restrained. But straightened is an old word, and it means narrowed or impeded. So if you're following an honest path, the wise person, the one who has wisdom that's using this wisdom, is going to be on a broad, relatively, and uncomplicated road. Now it may have some gentle bends, but you're not going to have those sharp pinhair curves. You're not going to have anything to hide. You're not going to be hampered by those twists and turns. If you always have some kind of act or a motive or statement or something that you're trying to cover up or obfuscate, hide, you're going to make your life incredibly complicated. Remember Charlotte's Web? That children's book? A lot of the things that we need to learn to live by and remember to live by, I think we learned as little kids. A lot of what you learned in kindergarten applies. And it seems so simple then, and it seems so complicated now, but we make it complicated. That's us doing it, not necessarily the rules. Solomon's saying that the wise person that's following that relatively unobstructed, wide, clear path, they're going to be able to run and not stumble. Because if you think about it, if you're actually physically running, if you're running on one of those twisty, turny, curvy, hairpin turn paths, you're going to stumble because you're always going to be off balance. You're always going to be trying to check, okay, well, how do I not get caught in my falsehood? How do I not get caught up in my deceitful logic? Because there's all kinds of pitfalls that you have to guard against. You're always traps you're trying to avoid and not fall into. We're not going to stumble in weariness in trying to keep correcting our course. We're not going to stumble. Does that mean that we're not going to run into obstacles? We're never going to have a bad day? We're not ever going to have problems? Of course not. God didn't promise us that. But when we live as God tells us we should, we probably don't cause ourselves a whole lot of extra pain. It's going to be easier. Not easy, but easier. Take hold fast, or take fast hold, sorry. That means you get a firm grip and you hang on to that. You hang on to that wisdom. You don't let it slip through. You don't let it get adulterated. You don't let it get blurred. It keeps clear. So when wisdom is passed on to you, you have to keep a tight hold of it. And once you acquire it, don't let go so you don't have to backtrack and make mistakes and redo and go back and after you've messed things up, because it's always easier to do things right the first time than it is to do damage control.
Yeah, it's kind of a hard topic because nobody wants instruction.
No.
We don't want to be instructed. And yet, if we follow instruction and do it right the first time, then we really learn anything.
Mm-hmm.
Because, most of us learn by the school of hard knocks.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately.
You don't say. I have never noticed that. Yeah.
But yeah, so as humans, we want to do, we have our own ideas, and and when we hear words of wisdom, it's kind of hard to always suck that in.
Oh yeah, especially when you're a teenager.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you
'Cause you
remember
think
you're a
you know
teenager.
everything.
Your parents were the most stupid people on the face of the earth, and they didn't understand anything. And as you get older, maybe they weren't as stupid as I thought they were. Doesn't mean they're right about everything.
Well, she did pretty good, huh?
Yes. Yeah, I say these days, we used to make fun of my great Aunt Wilsie, who grew up during the Depression. And she would literally, if you didn't use your dinner napkin, if you just patted your mouth, she'd cut that in half, and she'd saved the clean half. And she did a lot of things that seemed insane at the time, and now I really wish she were still around. I wish I had listened to some of the things that she was trying to teach me, because she was pretty smart in a lot of ways, because she'd seen some things. So.
Then I think we have an opposite problem whenever we get older, because then we get so set in our ways that we sometimes we're not teachable. And I think that's a lot of what Jesus ran into with the teachers of that day.
Yeah.
Because they were so set.
The church elders, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not to say that some experimentation or some trial and error on some things isn't a good idea, because we don't want to be completely stagnant. Because I think when we get to that point, we've strayed off the path and we're a little too far, because it's a spectrum.
It is.
It's a spectrum, because on the one hand you have moral relativity, maybe on the other end of the spectrum it's not exactly the opposite, but you have legalism where it's very rigid, and well, you do this because I said so, and that's the only reason you're getting. That's legalism. That's not really wisdom. Wisdom is more, okay, well, here's kind of the principle. Here's some examples. Here's how I learned the hard way. Here's where it's worked. Here's where it hasn't worked, and what happened. So that there's a little bit of explanation with wisdom. It's not just because I said so. If you take maybe actually a historical combined with a present day example, if you think about the Constitution and the Federalist Papers. Because the Federalist Papers was trying to explain, it was a collection of articles trying to explain why the rules or the principles that were being set forth in the Constitution were actually a good idea. So I think that would be, to me, that's an example of passing on wisdom. There was an experiment, because our Constitution was a grand experiment, for sure, still is. And we're still continually fleshing that out and trying to figure out, okay, we've got these principles, how do we apply them? Are these principles still good? And if we look back to the Federalist Papers, they're talking about why these are good ideas. They're trying to explain things. They're trying to pass some wisdom on. In terms of, well, we've seen human nature, we've seen how it works when applied to government, so here's why we think this is the way to do things. But in the end, getting back to the verses, Solomon's saying, when he's saying, let her not go, he's telling his son, when you learn these points of wisdom, when you understand these things, you have to internalize them once you acquire that knowledge, once you acquire that wisdom, because it's not like you're never going to have to think about it again. It's not like that math test or that chemistry test where you had to memorize some formulas and just long enough to pass that test that was coming up, and you were never going to have to remember it again because it wasn't going to be important. This is going to be important. You're going to need it again, so you need to, particularly these spiritual truths, you have to make sure that they remain ingrained in your brain. And we also have to guard them, because Satan's going to try to distract us. Satan's going to be like, look over here. Don't look at right here. Look at over here. something shiny, distracting, try to get you off that path. Try to get you to cut a new path. Enter not into the path of the wicked, and go not in the way of evil men. Avoid it, pass not it. Yeah, let's try this again. Can't tell I speak for a living. Avoid it, pass not by it, turn from it, and pass away. Still on this pathway analogy. Solomon's telling his son, if you deviate from that path of wisdom, that wider, whitish, even, straighter path of wisdom, you follow this bauble over here, this shiny thing, you're going to enter the way of the wicked. So you gotta stay on the correct path. Don't get lost. Enter not. Stress is important of don't even kind of like stray toward the edge of that path, the right path, the straight path. Don't dip your toe.
Yeah, that's that one verse, or pass not by it. Don't go window shopping. Don't weave over that way just to see what's going on.
Don't window shop. I like that. Yeah, don't window shop. Do not window shop.
Yeah,
Just-
what's going on over there? Yeah, don't weave
Yeah.
over. Just turn.
Yeah.
Just
Keep your eye in front. I remember one of the tricks when somebody was trying to teach me how to drive is, and I've seen this kind of in some internet stuff since, in terms of, like when you're trying to correct from a skid, look where you want to go. That's where you're gonna wind up steering.
Mhm.
And I think the same thing applies here. Because if you're, even if you're just kind of gawking around and sightseeing, if you're looking over here, next thing you know, you're steering over there. As you're window shopping,
Mhm.
as you're looking at the scenery, going, well, that's interesting, or wow, that looks tempting. Next thing you know, you're going to be steering that direction, whether you're intentionally mean to or not. That's where we're going to head. So,
Yeah, a good example of this would be Lot.
mhm,
He was in Sodom and Gomorrah. He was in it. He
Yeah.
didn't want to leave it,
so you have to turn from
but yet he was a righteous man.
Well, you have
But he
to-
didn't want to leave.
You have to, don't dally, you have to run straight ahead. And that's probably when it's the most important, to run straight ahead. And you have to pass away, you have to turn from it, you have to keep on that straight path. Because wisdom is kind of the foundation of having a stable life. You have to shun the seductive calls to follow the ways of the wicked. I think it was Homer in the Odyssey with the siren song. Did I get that reference right?
Yeah, I believe so.
Because there were the mermaids and they're singing this beautiful song, and it was trying to lure the ship to steer toward these jagged rocks that were going to break it up.
Yeah.
That maybe weren't really obvious, but it was going to be lethal anyway.
Right.
But dang, that song was good. It was tempting.
Yeah. And of course, modern reference would be, "Oh brother, where art thou?" That was after. That was a Depression version of the Odyssey.
Yeah.
And they got sidetracked because of the women singing in the river.
You just have to follow in God's path, and eventually we start understanding the world around us better. We don't have to dive into the pigsty to understand. Yeah, because God created the world, and who else is going to know better the best way for us to navigate it than the designer, than the creator? Yeah, so the Bible really is our playbook. Sometimes it's what not to do, but there's value in knowing what not to do. Okay, so here's what the reading skips very quickly. The wicked cannot sleep unless they do evil, and they are deprived of sleep unless they make someone stumble and fall. For they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. But the path of the just, righteousness, is like the light of dawn that shines brighter and brighter until it reaches its full strength and glory in the perfect day. The way of wickedness is like deep darkness. They do not know over what they stumble. That's the Amplified version. Obviously, it's a little bit easier to get through. So, after going through that short evaluation of the wicked ways, Solomon's emphasizing the effects of the way of wisdom to his son. My son, attend to my words, incline thy ear unto my sayings, let them not depart from thine eyes, keep them in the midst of thine heart. So he's kind of deviating from his path analogies, and he's starting to talk about parts of the body here. So you can kind of picture the son pulling on his earlobe to listen, to catch every word. Maybe not literally, but the gist of it is pay attention. Sit up, pay attention. And then he's talking about the eyes. So with the ears, you're receiving instruction. Kind of with the eyes, you're retaining it. You have to be vigilant. You got to remember it. Phrase "use it or lose it" come to mind. You know, you have to keep thinking about it, or that's going to go poof, and you're going, well, I remember something about, but I can't remember exactly what it was. I know there was this. I know there was this equation, but I don't remember what it was. And your eyes have to be alert to the danger of just kind of letting that wisdom go poof. It's a watch out warning. And then the third physical reference is the heart. Keep them in the midst of thine heart. And I could think of a bunch of different phrases that kind of reiterate this. You know, winning the hearts and minds. Taking it to heart. In your heart of hearts. So you can receive the teaching. You can hear it, you can see it, you can retain it. But you have to actually internalize that teaching. It has to become a part of you in order to influence your personality and your conduct. You know, you can know it, you can retain it. Does that mean you're going to believe in it, to adopt it, to follow it? Because you can know something and do something completely different. Sometimes intentionally, obstinately. So that's what he's saying, and keeping them in the midst of his son's heart. You have to internalize those things in order for it to work. Because you can know it, you can hear it, you can know it, you can remember it, you can recite it. If you don't follow it, it doesn't mean anything. Other than maybe you're being a jerk, knowingly. For they are life unto those that find them, and health to all their flesh. kind of weird, but this is what provides the motivation. The godly wisdom gives us the full life that God wants for us, that He planned for us. Unto those that find them, find that wisdom. So find reminds us that the fullness of life that God intended for us doesn't just come to us without effort. We have to actively seek it. It's a verb, find. We have to find that wisdom. We have to find how we are to apply it. And as a result, we have that fullness of spiritual life that we're supposed to have. And finding godly wisdom will translate into health to all their flesh. You have different kinds of health. You have physical health, you have mental health, and you have spiritual health. All those things need attended to. And, medicine, particularly modern medicine, will give us different remedies for ailments of body and certainly of mind, maybe not of spirit, but that's what we're attending to here as well, is we can't forget our spiritual health. Because you can be perfectly physically fit, maybe crazy as a loon, and not have mental health. Or you can have perfect mental health, perfect physical health, but if you don't have good spiritual health, you're missing an essential component of that full life that we're supposed to have. Because if we don't, directly or indirectly, that's going to negatively impact the body as a whole, of our life as a whole. Keep thy heart with all due diligence, or keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. The condition of your heart, of your morals, of your ethics, of your soul. Not the heart as an organ, but the heart in that context, the spiritual soundness of the heart in that context dictates the spiritual soundness of our lives. If we have not heard the wisdom, learned the wisdom, applied the wisdom, and internalized the wisdom, made it part of ourselves, we're not going to be spiritually sound. And we have to guard ourselves to protect from the evil without, that's out in the world, because Lord knows there's plenty of that. But even more so, maybe more importantly, is we have to protect our heart from the evil within us. Because remember, we're in the fallen condition. Hence, again, humans are messy. We're dumpster fires. We are spiritual and emotional dumpster fires that have to be regulated and controlled and monitored and directed on that right path. Because you've heard the phrase, the heart wants what the heart wants. Well, yeah, it does, but we have to be in control of that.
Every time I hear that scripture, I always think, guard your heart, for out of it flows the issues of life. Have you ever heard the phrase that hurt people hurt people?
Mm-hmm.
Everything, the condition of our heart will flow out to how we deal with almost every situation.
Mm-hmm.
Healed people help heal people. Loved people help love people. It's a natural thing. Mm-hmm. And that's why a lot of times I don't even know whether or not we can truly love unless we understand how loved we are by the Father.
Mm-hmm.
Because out of that flows the way that I treat you, the way that I look at you, the way I minister to you, the way I serve you. Everything flows out of that place of love from Him, that perfect love.
Because you've internalized things.
Yes.
You've made those part of yourself, an integral part of all of you. And until we achieve that, we're having problems. And hopefully we don't internalize the wrong things. So we have to control our heart, because if we don't do that, it's not going to work.
I guarantee probably a lot of your clients, they have the situations that they have because they themselves have been hurt and traumatized, and they don't know how to love properly. So,
And I think you're exactly right. I mean, that I was thinking when I was reading this early this morning in the wee hours, I was thinking back to a client that I visited in the regional jail yesterday afternoon. He's an adult, a very young adult, but so he's responsible for the direction of his life at some point, and certainly by this point. But I almost feel, sitting there talking to him, listening to him, read a letter that his dad, who was also arrested, that said, well, Mom and I don't have a whole lot of time, so you're gonna have to take the fall for everything. That was the gist of his letter. And it's like, really, I don't really know what to do with this. I don't know what to do about it. And he was talking about he's been in jail most of his life. Will probably be in jail for probably most of the rest of his life. And I think when I was sitting there asking him, trying to think in terms of the abuse and neglect case about what viable options he might have or what viable paths we might have, and asking him about, okay, well, what's your goal here? He wasn't being wildly and completely irrational in terms of what his chances are. It's like, yeah, no, I'm gonna lose my kid. I'm like, well, I'm sorry, but you probably are. I don't know that there's going to be a whole lot to work with, but how much longer do you think you're going to be in jail? Best circumstances ever. And that's going to be longer than we have to work with in this case. So, there's a lot of things because of where he's at, he's not going to be able to do that he should be, in order to be successful in the case, that he would need to do, and I don't think that's going to be an option for him because of these choices. But I'm sitting there thinking, he's made a lot of horrible choices, and he's not really saying that he hasn't. And I was talking about, well, at this point I had signed my rights over to my child temporarily because I couldn't take care of myself, let alone a child. Which is pretty insightful, if you ask me, because I don't think this guy stood a chance. Given his upbringing, he had zero good examples. He had all the bad examples. He learned all the wrong impulses.
But isn't it something that we all have the same heavenly Father?
Mm-hmm.
If we would just receive that. And Jesus is ultimately the answer to all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Because some parents will never be able to love you the way that you need to be loved, or heal that hole in your heart that you have, except Jesus can.
Yeah.
And people, if they would just find that out and just see that, then they would be able to break that cycle of all of these things that are destructive in their family line.
Yeah, I mean, he had been in the jungle of the wrong path, of the wrong paths his entire life.
Right.
I don't know if he'd ever really even seen a glimmer of the right path.
But still, in that, there is a time of recognition because in your life, you realize that these things didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
You know, these things are not working for me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I need to change and to go to a new direction. And some people see it and some people don't.
Yeah, and he was talking about he had gone through a period of time where he got in treatment, he got clean. He was sober, he had a job. You know, he was getting toward that right path. And then something happened and, you know, he watched the little sparkly bauble off to the side and he was just so used to taking that detour into the wrong path. That was his instinct because he had not internalized in his heart anything that he had learned about the good path, about the right principles. Yeah, he was starting to get exposed to them. Yeah, he was able to, you know, at least fake being on that right path for a while, but ultimately because he had not internalized those things in his heart, that wrong path was his first instinct every time. And anytime there's a challenge or a little bump or a little wobble, he's right back on that one of those wrong paths. And he took a lot of them. So I guess maybe the lesson for me here is that's why internalizing in your heart those principles and those values and that wisdom, unless we do that, we're just kind of blowing time, effort, and energy. Because unless you internalize them in your heart, which didn't happen for this person, unfortunately. And I see that with a lot of parents. You know, they try, they're like, well, I'm trying, I'm doing this, but you know, they're doing all these other things, and it's like, well, ignore that, you know, focus on I'm trying. But the problem is ultimately that doesn't let you become the parent that you need to be. And I'm not talking about an A+ parent, I'm talking about, you know, maybe even a D minus parent. They're not able to maintain that elevation up to the D minus level consistently enough that it's gonna stick. And that's what we're always afraid of when we get toward the end of the case, when it looks like somebody's been doing better, that it looks like they found that right path, and they've kind of stayed on it for a while. And what causes stomach aches and headaches and heartburn in the middle of the night for everybody, including the judges. Like, okay, have they internalized this stuff where it's gonna stick? You know, when
It's
we,
not hard to find the path, the straight path to begin with, let alone stay on it.
Mhm.
If somebody wasn't, like your parents taught you, like someone did.
but,
You know, somebody somewhere along the line has to show them the path and help them stay on it for a while.
remember how many verses back here?
They do what they've learned.
Yeah,
And that's what they've learned.
but, yeah, they've learned all this stuff, 16
Yeah.
through 19. They're A+ students in that. They have so
Learned
much
it.
experience.
So, I don't know, are you giving them enough time to find the path and stay on it? That would be my fear. How long should it take?
Yeah. Which verse here? Hang on a
The
second.
one interesting thing is that whenever it's in what I could see in my lifetime, it seems like people who have had the worst situations, and that's all they've seen. When they become saved and they experience the love of the Father, they are radically saved.
Well, I've known some people who not had good parents at all that decided this is what I don't want to do,
Right.
but they had somebody in their life that was helping.
But they saw it. And
over
I've read-
there. You know, I've helped some
Some
myself,
verse.
and they turned out to be good people, good
Yeah.
parents.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But I had to show them there was a different way.
Right.
Not all parents are like your parents. They're not all
Yeah,
drunks.
somebody needs to come alongside them.
Come over to my house more often.
Yeah. And maybe that is a place that, like, some of the men or women, that's why, you know, the Bible instructs us that we're to almost take younger people under our wing and help them. You know, our younger men, they need godly strong men. And our women, our young women, they need godly strong women to show them that there's a different way and a different path.
Yeah, because the wrong path is really shiny. It's
Right.
really fun short term. You know, and there's a lot of it. You know,
Right.
there's a dearth of examples of the right path where it looks appetizing, I guess. But, and I can't, for some reason, I'm having a hard time finding the verse, but earlier I was talking about you have to seek it out. So even if you weren't born into circumstances where you had good role models, where you had good parents, you still have to seek out. You have to look for it. It requires active effort on our parts. Yeah, maybe we have decent examples, but maybe we seek out additional examples, additional role models, maybe even more wise role models, and because it doesn't have to be just one. And it's not saying here that it's always got to be your parents, or always have to be your family members, or even have to always be members of your community. Because remember, Jesus went into, you know, dens of iniquity, basically. You know, and he's like, hey, hi, I'm a stranger. I'm just here to tell you there's a different way that you can do things that I think is a lot better than what you're doing. Well, not that I think that it is a lot better than what you're doing, and that you need to do things differently. Can we talk about that? So, I don't think that God necessarily expects us to only figure out the right path if we're blessed with kind of being plopped down in the middle of it or right close to it. We're still expected to find the right path, at least at some point, to seek it out. It's incumbent upon us. We have a duty. Again, this covenant thing that we've got going with God, where we have a very bad habit of focusing on God's responsibilities and duties on his end of the covenant and forget ours, because we have our own active duties and responsibilities. Our duties are not just to receive all the good things, not to have it handed to us. We actually have to exert effort on our end of the covenant. And in this instance, it's to seek that wisdom, to seek those good examples. And I understand, yeah, it seems very unfair, unjust even, you know, for somebody who is plopped down in the middle of a desert where there are no good examples. But these people still have a duty to try to seek. And I see again and again people, you know, who, you know, attorneys, social workers, law enforcement, you know, go in and say, okay, I can help you. Let me help you. Let me show you a different way. Let me hook you up with some resources. But like I always tell my clients, I will help you. If you want to go to detox, if you want to go to rehab, you call me. I will sit in the ER with you however many hours it takes. You know, and a lot of attorneys are of like mind. You know, is that in our job description? No. Will we do it anyway if it helps them? Yeah. You know, if that gets you over that bump, you know, we'll sit there with you in the ER for hours on end until they find you a bed and detox. You know, we'll help you get on that right path. We'll give you some maps. We'll give you directions. I can't do the heavy lifting for you. And that's what I tell my clients. I will help you as much as I can. I will give you resources. I will give you information. You know, I will try to get you services that you need. But when it comes to the hard part, when it comes to the heavy lifting, you have to do it. Nobody can do it for you. Yeah, you have to seek. So. I think this is where we left off. Is that where I had stopped?
Yeah, last 4, yeah.
Okay, alright, let me get through this and then I'll shut up, because I've been rattling on for a while. Okay. Put away from thee a froward mouth, and perverse lips put far from thee. Let thine eyes look right on, and let thine eyelids look straight before thee. Ponder the path of thy feet, and let all thy ways be established. Turn not to the right hand, nor to the left. Remove thy foot from evil. Nothing reveals the content of the heart as quickly as one's words. I don't think that's the only measure by a long shot, but I think that's your first warning. If somebody's words reveal their heart, and that their heart is not fully set on that good path, or maybe their heart's set on the evil path, pay attention, because that's your first warning. The froward mouth is a reference to deceitful speech that twists the truth. Remember, two truths and a lie? Perverse lips, that's bringing forth corrupt and unprofitable talk. What we want to do is, to begin with, maybe the easiest part is put evil words far away from us. Avoid them. So you gotta talk the talk, but as we have to control our mouths, we have to control our eyes. So, you know, when you see that shiny little bauble off to the side, and somebody's saying, "Hey, pay attention to this. Don't pay attention to this right here going on in front of you. Pay attention to this where my hand's waving." That's a distraction, and that's intentional. We have a lot of that in life, especially these days. I see time and time again that seems to be the playbook. Yeah. So some of these sparkly things, sometimes they're wicked, sometimes they're just irrelevant, and they're distracting us from what we need to do and what we need to pay attention to. But they do tempt us to go off on a frolicking detour path, you know, off the path that we're supposed to be on. You have to keep your eyes focused on that straight path, because again, you're going to drive where you're looking. So you need to keep looking straight ahead on that right path. And then Solomon's telling his son in verse 26, ponder the path of your feet. Your eyes are going to stay focused on the right. You got to keep your eyes focused on the right path, but you also need to make sure your feet follow and walk that right path as well. So think about what you're doing. It needs to be conscious. And if we plan soundly, we'll see that sound practice carried out. Our behavior should consistently follow a single purpose, to stay on that right path. Let all thy ways be established. In other words, be consistent. And it can also be a promise. If you're thinking about carefully staying on that right path, you're going to do God's will. You're going to glorify God. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Now, verse 27 talks about the wrong use of your feet, what not to do. Turn not to the right hand nor to the left, and remove thy foot from evil. So you have to stay on that right path. Don't start skipping off to the side and flirting with that berm. Don't stand there and kind of sightsee and look on that wrong path and go, huh. Because if we realize we've started to stray, you have to immediately turn and get in the center of that right path, center-ish, and turn from evil. Because there are dangers on both sides of that path. There, like I said, there's secularism. You know, if you say, oh, well, everything's morally relative, there's no real right or wrong, you know, it's what we feel, there's no real truth. That's the danger on that side. But then again, you know, you have legalism, you have subjective mysticism. You know, again, that moral relativity. So you don't want to go to check the box, but you don't want to go, well, anything goes. You've got to find that middle ground, that right path, and following the teaching of God's Word, which is in the Bible. Okay, Scott, there's your squirrel for the week. Okay, stick to God's laws and know right from wrong, because they do exist despite what modern society tries to tell us. Wisdom bears fruit when received in humility. You know, we can't go into it saying, well, I know best. You may have some good ideas, but you don't necessarily know best. So you need to listen, you need to think, you need to evaluate. Use the brain God gave you. Avoid straying into sin simply by avoiding evil paths. Sounds pretty easy, doesn't it? And like any discipline, growing in wisdom requires time and dedication. It doesn't just happen. It's a conscious effort, and you have to be proactive about it. Seeking wisdom isn't just academic. It's not just in books. Because if we live wisely,